One more time?
Yeah.
That's bound to happen. That's bound to happen. That's not going to happen. What sound disappears ever? Today we were teaching a lesson on responding to predictions. So the communicative objective for the lesson was for learners to respond to some predictions, sharing their opinions. And the linguistic aim of the lesson was for them to use phrases such as "that's bound to happen," "that's pretty likely to happen," "that might well happen," "that's so never going to happen," so that they could use a range of responses. In terms of the pronunciation objectives, we wanted them to develop both their listening skills and their speaking skills. We wanted them to be able to recognise the phrases spoken in rapid speech. But for their speaking, the speaking objective was more for them to sound more fluent, feel more fluent, and to sound more effective when saying these phrases, to incorporate some aspects of connected speech, such as weak forms, but not to sound exactly the full speed phrases that they were hearing. They didn't have, our objective was not for them to reproduce that pronunciation. And so to do this, we decided to explore some of Richard Caldwell's ideas. And you can find out more about those on his blog, but the idea is that there are three kind of ways that we can look at a phrase or a piece of language in terms of how it's pronounced differently. He has the greenhouse version, which is very stilted, so that might well happen. The garden variety, which is a little bit more fluent, that might well happen. And the jungle version, which is a bit wilder, that might well happen. And you can hear that in the jungle version, this is much more in line with maybe very proficient, fast speech with lots of elision and other features of connected speech.
So to give the students practice with listening and to expose them to features of connected speech, we decided to present the target language in a dictation exercise. So we chose 3 of the phrases that we were going to practice that day and dictated them. So the instructions for the students was simply to listen and write what they heard. So I repeated each of the phrases twice to give them a chance to hear, and then the second stage was when we had finished the dictation, they compared with the partner and tried to build up the phrases or come to some kind of agreement on the phrases together. During the feedback stage, I simply put up on the board what they had written, so making sure that I left a space, with the words that they hadn't quite heard or there was some kind of disagreement on. We left a space, so what we had on the board was a gap fill. And the next stage was simply by giving them the control of the listening, repeating each phrase in turn, and asking them, to try and hear, what was in the spaces. And that, the next stage then is to pass on the pron, as we were talking about before, is to share our knowledge of connected speech and pronunciation in general, and to tell them what's happening, to tell them why it's difficult. So, for example, in the first phrase, it was "that's so going to happen." That's so going to happen. So the problem was there is that "going to" was assimilating into "gonna," right? So you pass that on, you tell them it's "gonna," ask them to repeat it, "gonna," and you've shared that knowledge with them, and hopefully in the future they'll be then more prepared to understand that, listen to it and understand it in the future. In the second phrase, it was quite difficult for them was the phrase "there's no chance of that happening," and the problem there was the linking, the liaison of chance of. So what we had were two features of connected speech. We had vowel reduction of the of becoming of to the schwa, but not only that, you had the final s of chance and linking with the initial schwa of. So you had chance of. So it's just a case of, saying to the students, by the way, did you know that every time a word in a sentence in fast speech, when a word ends in a consonant sound and the next word begins in a vowel sound, they will, naturally join. So it's not chance of, but chance of. Yeah, so the idea here is just simply to pass on your knowledge, to tell them what's happening, to give them more insight into fast speech and connected speech. And as I said before, they will be more prepared in the future when they're listening to predict that might happen, and therefore there are two words and not one. There's no chance of that happening. There's no chance of that happening. There's no chance of that happening. One more? All right. There's no chance of that happening. Now compare with your partner.
Okay, so you've heard about Mark's part of the lesson where he was dictating some phrases. In my part of the lesson, we started with a prediction activity. The learners were given 3 more phrases and asked to anticipate what would happen, what happens with the pronunciation in these phrases, what words run together, what sounds might disappear, what words might change, like going to and gonna. And we give them time to work with a partner and think about these 3 phrases. And it was interesting to observe that as they did this, they used a lot of the board work techniques that Mark had used. They were circling, using big circles to identify words which were stressed in the phrase and small circles to identify words which were unstressed. And they were using lines to show which words ran together. I then decided to say the phrases very, very quickly in the jungle, in the wild version. And I asked them then to listen to me say the phrases a couple of times and see if it was in line with what they had predicted. And they did predict a lot of the features, such as the gonna and bound to, and kind of words coming together and weak forms using to instead of to. What they didn't anticipate was some of the elision which happens when we say phrases very quickly and very messily. And I used that as an opportunity to engage them in a discussion about the difference between pronunciation for listening and pronunciation for speaking. And I wrote greenhouse, garden and jungle on the board and modelled the 3 versions and asked them which was more, which was more relevant to their listening skills. When might they kind of struggle to understand something, and they said, well, in the jungle version. And then I asked them, what is your goal for your pronunciation? And we had a discussion about that and decided that maybe they wanted to kind of move from the greenhouse, where at times they feel a little bit stilted if they don't get enough time to work with new language, and it still sounds a little bit robotic. And they want to sound more like the garden variety, where there's some fluency and they feel more confident and comfortable with the language. And that's when we moved on to the next stage of the lesson. Karma, you were in Scotland. Did you understand the people around you?
One word. I didn't understand one word.
So this is what we're thinking about now, how you can listen better, okay, by predicting the pronunciation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read these 3 phrases with my full-on Scottish accent, and you can see if what you predicted is correct. Are you ready? That's about to happen. That's about to happen. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. There's a good chance that'll happen. There's a good chance that'll happen. Okay, tell each other, did you predict the changes? Sounds coming together, sounds disappearing. What's different between the written and what you hear. The written form of what you hear. Mara, what's different? What's different from how it sounds to how it's written? What sounds disappear? What sounds join? What changes? That's bound to happen. What sound disappears completely? That's bound to happen. The D, exactly. That's bound to happen. Yeah, even the T, that's bound to happen. It sounds. Fauna.
Yeah, I feel that the pronunciation stage of this lesson was successful for a number of reasons. During the pass on the pron stage, a lot of students commented on how the written form and the spoken form was so different, and some of them also said it was quite important to know that final consonants join with initial vowels, because they didn't know that before the lesson, and they hadn't quite understood that part of the phrase. And I could also see them becoming more confident as the stage went on. By the time we got to the third phrase, there were nods of agreement. Oh yeah, I understand why that's happening. And by the time that Nicola asked them to predict what would happen to these phrases before she drilled, the greenhouse, garden, jungle versions, the students were quite comfortable and they're quite happy with the challenge of doing that. And I observed quite a few correct predictions, before she did that. And when she was drilling the greenhouse, garden, jungle versions, they seemed quite comfortable, with the garden version of the phrases, and they were producing them quite well. And they weren't phased at all, by her full Scottish Edinburgh jungle version either. They just took it on. They were quite happy with it. And during the communicative activity, I noticed quite a lot of good production of these phrases. Bound to happen, and it's so going to happen were particular favourites among the students, and we could see that they were enjoying producing them, and I think they were quite enjoying us listening to them produce them as well. So yeah, I think successful. It was nice to hear in the end.
What about the next one? That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. What sound disappears ever? Okay, so to reflect on the lesson, I think that it was really positive. I think it, in terms of the listening skills development, is what we'd hoped for. We engaged in some discussion. So this commandment of passing on the pron to the students, this idea of sharing information about what happens with pronunciation when we say phrases very quickly, and how that impacts on their listening and how it can help them to be ready for the next time they hear that phrase or a similar phrase. This passing on the pron, I think, worked very well, and students were extremely engaged and interested to hear this, and there were lots of nodding heads and smiling faces and questions. And also the commandment of listening needs more pron. I think that was definitely an interesting experiment in this lesson. There were lots of quotes from learners, which you can see here, saying how they felt supported in this lesson and how it was useful for them to focus on hearing these phrases again and again and again. And finally, I think it was effective as an example of every language point as a pronunciation point. One student commented on the fact that having repeated practice with a kind of a new phrase, taught not as a grammatical item, as a grammar item, but as a kind of a piece of language, a chunk of language, for her was very helpful.